Welcome along to a special episode of the Salt and Sauce Show. I'm David Simmonds. My guest tonight is criminologist Dr. Sandra Lean. We're going to be following up from Monday night's murder in Midlothian. Due to the current pandemic, we're unable to welcome Sandra into the studios here, so I'm going to nip outside and we're going to be asking some of the key questions to do with this case.
I didn't know Jodi or Luke before Jodi was murdered, but from what I've come to know of her over the years and what I've come to know of Luke, by all accounts, they hit it off from the minute they met each other and just really, really enjoyed being in each other's company. The story about the moped boys, first of all, they were seen coming through a local tool hire business at just before closing time, which was 5 o'clock. The moped, it was an old sort of hand cobbled together thing. It kept cutting out. It was really, really noisy. They were then seen pushing the moped up the New Battle Road towards the path. And then at 5:15, which was eventually to become the time that they said was a time of death for Jodi, the bike was seen by a witness, propped against the wall, but the two lads were not with the bike and were nowhere to be seen. The police put out an appeal for the boys on the moped on the Friday. That was the Friday the 4th of July. One came forward on the 5th and one came forward on the 6th, and the media reported on the 7th that they'd been eliminated from the inquiry. We later found out that they'd actually lied about the time they were on the path. They said they were on the path almost an hour earlier than they actually were. And it wasn't until the police went back and got the statements from, the official statements rather, from the tool hire people, that they noticed the time discrepancy and had to go back and get them back in again to say why did you lie about the time. They told various stories at different times. One said the clock in his house was at the wrong time. I can't remember what the other stories were now, but really none of them made any sense, because one of them had an appointment at a specific time and was coming back from that appointment when they came through the tool hire place, so he knew what time his appointment was. One of the boys on the moped cut his own hair. Now, we've had various reports the day after or the second day after, reports of another man that might have matched his description started to come in the newspapers. Anyway, he chopped his hair off with scissors, just hacked it off with scissors, made such a mess of it that he then had to go and get a barber to basically shave it because he'd made such a mess of it. And when he was asked in court why he did that, he said he didn't like curly hair, having a bad hair day. We didn't find out about Mark Kane until 2006, so 3 years after the murder. And it was discovered he was living in New Battle Abbey at the time of the murder, and his name had been brought to police attention from the beginning, from the first week. Regardless of any of the theories about Mark Kane and where he was that night and what he was doing, because we know he told different stories to different people about where he was and what he was doing. But he looks a lot like Luke, or he did at the time looked a lot like Luke. And one of the main things about the prosecution case against Luke was that he was seen at one end of the path by one independent witness and at the other end of the path by two independent witnesses in a car. So my point in all these years has been, How did those witnesses know that it was Luke they saw and not Mark Kane? And if it was Mark Kane, the prosecution case that he was there at this time, that Luke was there at this time and there at that time, no longer stands. So no matter what speculation there's been about Mr. Kane, that remains the fact. If you were driving past in a car, 10-second observation, would anybody know for sure if they didn't know either of the males? The condom found at the scene, it was found in the early hours of the morning during that first search in the woodland strip, but they weren't able to match the DNA to any known person. And very quickly, which I thought was really surprising, very quickly they tried to distance the condom from the murder, which again seemed very strange to me. There had been theories that it had been a sexually motivated attack, or that Jodi had disturbed somebody committing a sex act in the woods. Those were all dropped very quickly, as was interest in the condom and this attempt to distance it. So again, it wasn't until 2006 that a match came up in relation to a completely different matter, and the Crown informed the defence team that this person was the person who left the condom, which makes it all the stranger that at appeal, the Crown argument was that there was no link whatsoever between the condom and this guy, James Falconer, sorry. Yeah, it was the Crown that had found the match and sent it to the defence. So. Mr. Falconer's story to the police was that he'd gone into the woodland strip to masturbate because he didn't have any privacy at home. He lied about a number of things, he was mistaken about a number of things in his statement, which when the police checked up and went, no, that's not right and that's not right, they got him back in and said, why did you tell us this and why did you tell us that? And he's on record as saying, I had to say something. When we followed up with the police and asked why there was no further inquiry into this particular line, they told us the case was closed because Luke Mitchell had been convicted. For the first couple of weeks, the police were putting out that they expected DNA results to confirm their mainline inquiry, which clearly was Luke at the time. Then the DNA results came back with nothing of Luke, but DNA from Jodie's sister's boyfriend on the t-shirt she was wearing. And again, in normal circumstances, you think, uh-oh, this guy's going to have some explaining to do. What appears to have happened is the police went back to the sister's boyfriend and asked if it was possible that Jodi may have borrowed the t-shirt from her sister, and that would explain the DNA on it. It actually gets slightly more ludicrous. It was then claimed that the DNA had been transferred onto the t-shirt in a washing machine, in a wash cycle, and then that it had been further transferred to different parts of the t-shirt by rainwater transfer. In a case like this, it's been very high profile. Luke's been in prison for 17 years. There is no will to reopen the case. The police have no will to reopen the case. You can see by the statements they've made just in the last week. We're satisfied, We're not looking for anybody else. The only way I believe we will ever see this case properly re-examined is with an independent review like they did with Hillsborough. Bring in a completely independent team of experts, give them everything, and let them go through it, let them make recommendations and state their findings and what have you. And that way I could go away and live a normal life like I used to. I don't know that there's ever been that sort of independent panel inquiry type thing ever done in Scotland for a case like this. And I suspect there would be arguments that it's circumventing the justice system or the court system or something like that. We have started a petition asking for exactly that. It won't be enough on its own. It won't be enough on its own. We know that, but the idea is to raise public awareness and to bring public pressure, because this was done in all our names. This was done in the name of justice for all of us. And if it wasn't done properly, then none of us, and least of all Jodi, has had justice. When the detectives, the private investigators, looked at the case for the Channel 5 documentary, they identified a number of people that, had they been running the investigation, would have been persons of interest. Now that doesn't mean suspect, and people are running away with this word suspect. Persons of interest. So they're flagged up for various things that aren't answered properly, and then eliminated literally by a process of elimination. No, that can't be right, that can't be right. What they were left with were a group of people who had a number of unanswered questions, some more than others, which left all of them, had this been a new investigation, they would still all be persons of interest until those questions had been answered. So you saw them well listed people. I think there were about 7 names on that list in total. The media coverage at the time, I'd never seen anything like it, and to this day I struggle to understand why it went the way it did. Now we do know, although they've denied it, we do know that the media were being fed directly by the police. We know that because there was stuff from inside Luke's house, photographs from inside Luke's house. Well, those reporters were never inside Luke's house. The only place they could have come from was the investigation. So was it a combination of media feeding police, feeding local fear, feeding back in again, because of the absolute hysteria? And the media, I have to say, were largely responsible for that local hysteria, and really need to take some accountability for that now. The Daily Record's five reasons he's guilty, or whatever their article was called, is full of inaccuracies, is the first thing that I would have to say. Luke's brother, from the early stages, said Luke was in, they had their tea, they went out to their different pursuits that night, and the police would not accept his brother's accounts. And they were saying things like, that's no good enough, we can't accept that. And then they were actually like putting pictures in his head, saying picture this and picture that. So when he was arrested 10 months later, and again, the arrest of his brother was outrageous. This guy, his only crime apparently at the time, or the only crime that's suspected of him at the time, was perverting the course of justice, as in telling a lie. So they stopped him in his car, in the road, 5 police cars, dragged him out of his car, laid him out on the road. All these officers descended on him, screaming at him, bundled him into the car, took him away, and then spent 6 hours interrogating him without a lawyer. Donald Finlay said at appeal, they tried to break him the same way they tried to break Luke. So whatever changes people say were made to his story, there's how he was railroaded. They would not accept a single thing he said. And the idea that somebody phoning the speaking clock is indicative of guilt, of murder, is, well, it's surprising. But the fact of the matter is, in the phone logs, Luke had a habit of calling the speaking clock in the morning and after he got in from school. I think there were 18 calls to the speaking clock in the lead up to that day. And why did he phone the speaking clock? Who knows? We know that the clock in the kitchen was unreliable. It was a battery clock. And the only other clock in the kitchen, which was the microwave clock, was never on because it was switched off at the wall when it wasn't in use. I don't know, maybe like the voice. There is no real explanation for it. The night Jodie's body was found, I think as everybody knows now, Luke was taken to the station. The other members of the search trio were allowed to mingle with other people. They went back to Jodie's mum's house. Police didn't even come to start speaking to them until 4.5 hours later. And in the first month, so up to the end of July, all 4 of the searchers were telling the same story, that they'd gone back down to double check the path and Luke's dog had suddenly alerted. She'd bolted over to the wall, she was air sniffing, she was scrabbling at the wall. And then at the end of that month, the 3 members of Jodie's family's statements started to change. And we ended up 17 months later with the dog did nothing. Luke just went straight to the V, over, found the body, was completely unemotional about it. When their early statements are absolutely clear, everybody was in hysterics. I knew from the concern in his voice that it was something bad. Luke looked like he was in complete shock. Yeah, showed no emotion. Why did those statements change? Who knows? Again, this is a family in absolute despair. If somebody goes back to them and says, are you sure about that? Could it have been this? They wouldn't know what time of the day it was, in fairness. But that's how the story changed, that's how it developed. And clearly that was used against Luke at trial. How could he have known that the body was there? The dog didn't react, he must have known Jodie was there. There's never been a murder weapon found or identified. There was a find a couple of years ago, quite close to the murder scene, and that knife was buried. It was turned up by somebody that was actually doing some work, and you know, it had been buried. They took it to the police. And that was the last we heard of it.
Never been a follow-up on that.
So we don't know. I mean, there was the knife found up at the new school campus a good few years ago, and it was all over the papers because it had the name Luke on the handle. Because yeah, you know, obviously, if you're going to leave evidence, make sure they know it's yours. So that was all over the newspapers. That was a huge deal, and then ruled out. Now they find this one, nothing, not a word. And we were never able to get any information on it. So to this day, we don't know. In order to get the case back to the Court of Appeal, there would have to be another application to the SACRC, and that would be on the basis of new information. Now, we're in a really difficult situation here because DNA testing, for example, has really improved in the last 17 years. But to use new techniques, we would need to get the samples released for retesting. And you have to give a good reason for asking for them for retesting. And believe it or not, because that lad might be innocent is not a good reason, according to the courts. We've organised, or a group supporting Luke have organised a peaceful protest outside the Scottish Parliament on the 24th of April, starting at midday. And again, our aim is not to cause upset or be disrespectful in any way. It's simply to say, here we are, however many hundred local citizens who don't think justice was done for us. And we'd like to see it properly addressed. The circumstances that Corrine was living in were horrendous. And no matter what anybody thinks of Luke, nobody, in this day and age, nobody should have to live like that. I'm very, very, very relieved to be able to say Corrine's since been housed. She's safe, she's warm, and she can have some semblance of a normal life now. Because as she said in the documentary, her health has suffered as a result of the stress, but certainly as a result of living in those conditions. So, and you know, again, a big, big thank you to everybody who reached out to help her, because it was just awful. One day, no matter how long it takes, this conviction will be shown up for the terrible miscarriage of justice it's been for everybody involved. And as long as I'm breathing, I'm going to keep pushing for that. But now there are thousands of people saying the same thing. So let's hope it doesn't take another 18 years.
Thank you to my guest criminologist, Dr. Sandra Lean, for coming on the Salt and Sauce show this week. I understand, obviously, the subject we're discussing does split opinions. It can be a bit touchy at times. But 18 years on from the case, we're still discussing it. It shook the whole of Midlothian, if not the whole of Scotland and Great Britain and beyond. We've got some future guests lined up to do with this case, so make sure you stay tuned to State of Mind Media, Friday nights at 8 on the Salt and Sauce show.